How do you create insulin resistance? By fucking about with your blood sugar, constantly eating sugar, bringing it up and down, eating crappy food.
So what Eddie is representing is an insulin-induced model of insulin resistance. And all this simply means is Eddie is postulating that high levels of insulin inside of our bloodstream somehow stop the cells from further responding to insulin. In the same way that if someone was constantly yelling at you, you would stop responding. Which is why we should stop eating carbohydrates so we no longer have to produce as much insulin. With that being said, there are several lines of evidence that show that this is not the cause of insulin resistance. And the two main drivers of insulin resistance are inflammation and an accumulation of fat inside of our cells. Insulin is extremely complex, but I'm going to try and make it very simple. Insulin binds to this receptor, which causes a bunch of different proteins inside of the cells to respond. And the end result is what's called translocation of a GLUT4 receptor, which in simpler terms means the GLUT4 receptor goes from inside the cell to the membrane of the cell. And this receptor allows glucose to enter into our cells, which is why the body releases insulin in response to dietary carbohydrates, because carbohydrates raise our blood glucose, and insulin allows this glucose to get inside of our cells. With that being said, when we accumulate a lot of triglycerides or fat inside of our cells, they can be turned into what are called ceramides and diacylglycerols, represented by DAG. And the only thing that you have to understand is that these compounds can inhibit this GLUT4 receptor from ever getting to the membrane. This is referred to as insulin resistance, because despite insulin binding to the receptor, the cell does not respond correctly and allow glucose into the cell. Another thing that can cause this insulin insensitivity is inflammatory compounds, which is why many people notice that when they get sick, their blood glucose levels may rise, because despite having the same amount of insulin, their cells are not responding correctly and not allowing glucose into the cells. And to further my last point about how gaining excess fat can cause insulin resistance, fat cells can actually produce inflammatory compounds. And the more overweight we get, the more inflammatory compounds that are produced by our fat cells, and the more insulin resistant we become because of the detrimental effects from these inflammatory compounds. And excessive body fat accumulation is caused by eating a caloric surplus, whether that surplus is coming from fat or carbohydrates. With that being said, it does actually appear that high-fat diets can actually increase insulin resistance. So one way to study the mechanisms of insulin resistance and what insulin actually does is through looking at type 1 diabetics, because these individuals are actually injecting insulin, and the way that their body responds to this insulin gives us great insight. And in type 1 diabetics, at the same level of carbohydrate, the higher the fat amount in a particular meal, the more insulin they are required to use, because they are more insulin resistant. And this is because a higher fat diet can increase the amount of those ceramides and diacylglycerols found inside of the muscle and the liver, which could acutely, meaning in the short term, cause more insulin resistance. Which is why it's a well understood phenomenon, even by people who promote the ketogenic diet, that a higher fat diet can cause a greater degree of insulin resistance if you immediately switch from a high fat diet to a high carbohydrate diet. And I hope to touch on the fact that insulin is our fat storing hormone, meaning we can't store fat if we're eating a high fat, low carbohydrate diet because we won't be producing as much insulin. But I'll touch on that in a future video. And if you want to learn how to take control of your health and energy, send me a DM to sign up for coaching.